Hey U.S. history students, today we're continuing to talk about World War I. We're going to hit on some of the major aspects of the war, some of the new technology that was introduced during the war, and then the ending of the war and the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. For a long period of time, there was a stalemate happening on the battlefields in Europe. This was mostly due to the trench warfare. Neither side could really advance. A lot of people were being killed, and there's this big stalemate along what's known as the Western Front. Here you can see a map of the Western Front. You can see this is the area where you have a lot of trenches and trench warfare going on. You've got the Allies trying to advance this way and push the Germans back. You've got the Germans trying to fight this way and make their way, and it just ended up being a big stalemate, and neither side was able to move very far. Once America starts joining the fight in World War I, we start to see kind of a break in the stalemate. So we have 2.5 years of fighting. The Allied forces are exhausted, and then the Americans come and they start to join in once we join the war in 1917. One of the main contributions that the Americans gave the Allied war effort is fresh legs, fresh troops, enthusiastic, ready to go. These American infantry, they were known as doughboys. This nickname, a lot of historians believe it goes back to the Mexican-American War from back in 1846, when the American soldiers were walking through the different parts of southwest United States and Mexico, and they were kicking up a lot of dust and were covered in dust, white chalky dust. Others think it was due to their white belts that they wore, but the term doughboy is stuck, and it's synonymous with American infantrymen, American soldiers, specifically the AEF, American Expeditionary Forces. And most of these doughboys, when they hit the beach in Europe to go fight in World War I, they had never been very far from their home. They had never really seen the outside world, and so this was a very new thing for them. The major fighting force that the United States sends to Europe to help in World War I is known as the AEF, the American Expeditionary Forces, and they're mainly sent to the Western Front in France, and their leader is General John J. Pershing. And so they fight alongside the British and the French during 1917 and 1918. That brings us to this guy, John J. Pershing. He's important because obviously he's the commander of the AEF. And he's important because he keeps the American troops together. So the British and the French, they wanted the Americans to kind of fill in their gaps and join them under French officers or British officers. But Pershing says, no, we're going to keep Americans together, and they're going to be led by Americans in groups of Americans. And so that's one contribution of Pershing. In the late spring of 1917, the Germans are making their way into France. They're pushing towards Paris. They're within 50 miles of the capital of Paris. And so it's a crucial time that the Americans get involved in this war. And so Americans land, they start fighting, and they immediately play a huge role in pushing back the Germans. So in July and August, there's a huge battle going on. As the Germans are trying to advance, the Americans are helping the French to hold the line and push the Germans back. So the Americans really helped the Allies push the Germans back during the summer months of 1917. And so now that the Germans are being pushed back, we've got the Battle of Argonne Forest is another crucial battle and event in World War I. So this takes place from September through November. So the Germans are being pushed back. It's also called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. And basically this is the kind of the last effort of the Allies to push back the Germans, and it stretches along the whole entire part of the Western Front, and it's the Americans and the Allies pushing back the Germans, making sure that they don't advance, and helping to push them back into Germany. So the goal of the Battle of Argonne Forest is to capture an important railroad station, to try to cut off the Germans from their army in France and make them retreat. And so they were able to do that. They were able to push the Germans back. And because of the Allied victory, most historians believe this is what helped speedily push along the end of the war. So the end of the war comes right after this battle, and the Germans surrender. One of the heroes of the Battle of Argonne Forest is Sergeant Alvin York, and he was initially a guy from Tennessee. He was a blacksmith, and at first he was what's called a conscientious objector. That means that he didn't feel like it was morally right to go fight, and so he objected to fight and he wouldn't go fight. But eventually he changed his mind and he found it acceptable, and he went off to war as a doughboy and was fighting in the Battle of Argonne Forest. And he's known because during this battle, on October 18th of 1918, he had a rifle and a revolver, and he killed 25 Germans and captured 132 prisoners. And so when he returned home, he was promoted to sergeant. He was an American hero, and he got the Medal of Honor because of his attack on a German machine gun nest, and because he saved his fellow soldiers, and because he killed so many Germans basically by himself. So it became Alvin York, an American hero, World War I, Battle of Argonne Forest. So now that Germany is being pushed back, they're being pushed back to Germany from France, from the Western Front. Their ally, the Ottoman Empire, they surrender October 31, 1918. Austria-Hungary surrenders on November 3rd, and Germany is left to fight on their own, but they're too exhausted to continue, and so Germany ends up surrendering on the 11th hour at the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and they signed a truce which ended the fighting of the Great War. Now we're going to talk about some of the major technological innovations that came out of World War I and that were first used during World War I. The first one is the machine gun. This is important, an important new technology. It's relatively new in World War I. It had a lot of issues. It got too hot, but it was really important because it led to the stalemate on the Western Front, because you couldn't cross any territory without a machine gun shooting at you. And so it made it very difficult to gain ground and made it very easy to defend ground. Number two is poison gas. So poison gas, which mainly was chlorine gas or mustard gas. A lot of this was used in trench warfare. It was thrown into trenches to force the opposing side to evacuate their trench so that they would have to come up and you would be able to shoot them, or it would be used to create a smoke screen. If you had gas masks, you could set up a smoke screen, run through it, and then do kind of like an attack where they couldn't see you coming. And so machine guns, poison gas. And the next is airplanes. So airplanes, at the very beginning of the war, they didn't really have the capability to fight or to shoot or any of that kind of stuff, and they were mainly used as spotters. So you had trench warfare going on, you had the planes flying up above, kind of doing reconnaissance missions, finding out where the enemy was. Most planes were unarmed. They didn't have machine guns on them or anything like that, but the pilots would carry handheld weapons, so they weren't really effective at shooting each other down or shooting targets on the ground, but they were mainly targets. Later, towards the end of the war, larger planes were created that were able to bomb the enemy, but this was much later in the war. And fourth, we have tanks. So tanks were introduced in World War I, but they were very unreliable, and they weren't very effective because it was hard for them to cross the terrain. And so they were used to some effect, and they did help to try to ease the Western Front. It did give the two sides some mobility to go back and forth because they could cross over certain areas without getting shot down by a machine gun nest or something like that. So it did give some mobility and did allow for the moving of the front lines somewhat during World War I. Tanks aren't going to become super effective until World War II, though. And the fifth piece of technology is going to be the trench warfare. So people dug in trenches. This mainly happened along the Western Front between France and Germany. And basically, it's where you kind of build a trench, and in between the two trenches, called no man's land. It's very hard to cross the area because both sides have machine guns set up, pointed at no man's land, where you can't really make a move. It's very good for defense and not allowing the other side to move towards you, but it's very hard to play offense in trench warfare because you get shot down so easily. It's very easy to play defense. Here's a little map of what trench warfare would look like. So you've got a bunch of trenches back here. You've got your artillery firing, and so you would be shooting artillery over to this side, and there's the same thing set up over here. And this is no man's land. You can't cross here. You got barbed wire. You got this whole area. It could be anywhere from 25 yards to a mile wide. And if you try to cross here, you're just going to be shot down by machine guns and guys in the other trenches who have, they can play defense. And so it makes it very hard to move. Here's a few pictures of trenches. So the impact of these technological innovations is basically it led to a stalemate. Neither side could move. Neither side could get the upper hand. They weren't able to advance, and millions of lives were lost, and nothing was really gained back and forth. So that's the significance. So we talked about the war ended November 11th of 1918. Here's the Chicago Tribune, the Great War ends, and now we're going to talk about some things that happened after the war. So if you remember, while the war is still going on, Wilson brings up his 14 points. So Wilson's 14 points are the things that he wanted to create after the war to make sure that no wars happen in the future. Remember, he called World War I the war to end all wars. So he lays out his 14 points of what he wants to see happen. So Wilson brings his 14 points to the treaty table, and he starts talking with the other allies about his 14 points and what he wants to do. Well, the other nations, they reject most of his stuff, and he gives up on a lot of them in order to get what he really wanted, his main thing, which is the League of Nations. And so he gives up most of his first 13, but he stays true to his 14th point, which is to create that body that's going to try to keep peace in the world, the League of Nations. And so the Treaty of Versailles is created and signed in June of 1919. So the leaders and the allies and the leaders of the defeated nations, they come together in Versailles and they sign this treaty. And the Treaty of Versailles did several important things. So it created some new nations, gave independence to some new peoples, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. It broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and broke up the Ottoman Empire. And then it forced Germany, or barred them from maintaining an army, so they couldn't build up their military. They could only keep a small peacekeeping force. And then it put the blame for the war onto Germany and forced them to repay all of the war debt, all of the money that the Allies had spent on fighting the war. It forced Germany to repay that money to them because they say, hey, Germany, it's your fault that this war happened, and so you got to pay us back. So they were forced to repay $33 billion in reparations to the Allies. So here's the ultimate problem, the ultimate weakness with the Treaty of Versailles, is Germany was treated very harshly. And so this kept a lasting peace in Europe from occurring. Because the Germans were humiliated, they were forced to admit sole responsibility for the war, which in reality they were part of the war, but they were not the sole responsibility of the war. But they were forced to sign this war guilt clause saying that they were guilty. And they were forced to repay all that money that was basically impossible to repay back. And so Germany had land taken from them. They were humiliated and forced to sign that they were responsible for the war. And then they were forced to repay an insurmountable amount of money back. And all this is going to lead to the Second World War, because you have Germany being put down, and then they're going to rebuild, and they're going to try to gain their confidence back. They're going to try to gain their prestige back. And the Treaty of Versailles is really going to lead us into the next World War, even though it was meant to stop further wars from happening. And then that brings us to Wilson's 14th point of his 14 points, the treaty, or the League of Nations, that's created in the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles is created, and Wilson brings it home triumphantly, saying, look what we did. But back home, the treaty was not loved by all, especially the League of Nations part. That was very much disliked by a lot of Republicans who didn't like Woodrow Wilson. And there was a couple of conservative senators, especially Henry Cabot Lodge. You need to remember his name, Henry Cabot Lodge. He did not like being joined up economically and militarily with other countries around the world. He felt like America should stay independent and neutral and not be pulled into other wars. And so basically Congress rejected the treaty. So Woodrow Wilson's whole idea of League of Nations, he got it created, he put in the Treaty of Versailles, brings it back home, and it's the Senate's job to accept and ratify all treaties the president makes. But the Senate rejects this treaty. And so the United States does not even join the League of Nations, which was Woodrow Wilson's whole idea. The American president's idea, and the U.S. doesn't join. Russia also does not join, so two major world powers are not joining this league, which is going to set it up for failure. So the overall legacy of World War I, back home in the United States, we've got a strengthened military. The government is more powerful. They took a lot of control during the war as far as the economy goes and for shutting down dissension with Schenck versus U.S. and that kind of stuff, espionage and sedition acts. You've got a lot of propaganda, so a lot of people are fearful in society. The war created political instability. New countries are created. Territory is taken away from old countries. You've got the Treaty of Versailles hurting Germany. You've got the first communist state being created in Russia. And then Woodrow Wilson is calling this war the war to end all wars. But really, how World War I was resolved is going to lead the United States and the world into an even deadlier and worse conflict called World War II in a matter of years.